How many people do you think have read Darwin's Origin of Species? In fact, how many people have read it? My guess is that you would find in the general population almost no one. You may have students who carried it home, but it's rarely read. And even less so, Darwin's more popular book, more popular at that time, The Descent of Man. And if people actually read these books, they would come to conclusions for themselves because they were written at a time long before DNA had been discovered, before the discovery of proteins, hormones, so many things that are just part of our understanding today of how organisms work. Darwin worked in relatively, really, very early days in a vacuum. In almost every other, and perhaps every other field of science, things have progressed. When it comes to this area of the origin of species, how species change, they haven't. It's gotten locked in. We'll share a little bit as to why that is today. But let me read this from chapter 6 of Darwin's Origin of Species. He says, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. And so what he is saying is there is not a missing link. There are millions of them. That there is this gradual change from one organism to another as even new organs, whole new organs are developed. And he says if you can't find that in the fossil record, his theory would break down. Well, in the Wall Street Journal, August 16th, 1999, Philip E. Johnson penned an article about a Chinese paleontologist who lectures around the world and says that the fossil record in his country are completely inconsistent with the Darwinian theory of evolution. In other words, there is no gradual change. He said that the major animal groups, I'm quoting now, appear abruptly in the rocks over a relatively short time, rather than evolving gradually from a common ancestor as Darwin's theory would have predicted. When this conclusion upsets American scientists, he wryly comments, quote, in China, we can criticize Darwin, but not the government. In America, you can criticize the government, but not Darwin. Well, I was a committed evolutionist when I was younger. I am now, however, convinced that there was an Adam, there was an Eve, and that God created them both. In modern America, that likely brands me as a fool or an ignoramus. I would encourage you to examine the evidence for yourself. There is a growing tide of individuals, scientists, others, educated individuals even, who are coming to the conclusion that the imperial teaching of Darwinism has no close. His facts just do not, or the facts just do not support it. It is in itself a religion based on the premise that the fossil record would provide a gradual transition from one species to another, reflecting the core mechanism of Darwin's theory of evolution, which was mutation, and that slight mutations over time eventually add up to changes in species. It has not happened. We have no evidence for that. Just the opposite. The fossil record shows the sudden appearance of entire new life forms after long periods of stasis, with a particularly large number of new organisms appearing in the Cambrian explosion. Darwin's theory does not explain that. It is an indisputable truth. The fossil record does not match the gradualism needed to support Darwin's theory of natural selection, where the weaker mutations are culled out and the stronger ones, more appropriate for the environment, are encouraged and develop and change even further and advance even further. The scientific method of experimentation and reproducibility does not support it either. We'll look at that more in future weeks. It's such a great problem that in 1972, committed evolutionists and paleontologists Niles Eldredge and Stephen Jay Gould published a landmark paper to address this lack of intermediate missing links with a theory called punctuated equilibria. Eldredge and Gould proposed that the degree of gradualism required by Darwinism is virtually non-existent in the fossil record, and the stasis, or lack of change, dominates history of virtually all fossil species. And so they suggested that there is an equilibrium. We don't see evolution. We don't see anything happening for long periods of time, even millions of years. And then the stasis, or the lack of change, is suddenly punctuated by an evolutionary event. And we suddenly, almost instantly in terms of time, see these changes. And because it happens in such a brief period of time, the intermediate species, the intermediate changes all disappear. There are so few of them, and it's such a short period of time that we just haven't found them yet. Yet, when you look at it, they simply described in their theory what they saw. Nothing happens for millions of years, then there's an evolutionary explosion, then nothing happens for millions of years. Well, yeah, that's what we see. Everything is in equilibrium and is suddenly shattered by the sudden new organisms. Darwinian evolution is generally recognized as naive at best today in higher education, but you are only let in on this secret at a graduate and postgraduate level. Now, there are other competing theories. Quantum evolution is another one, trying to explain this lack of evidence. Yet we still teach our young children Darwinian evolution. As a graduate student, I was at the Museum of Natural History, meeting with some paleontologists and anthropologists, along with other folks in my class. And a question came up about the dinosaurs. What happened to the dinosaurs? Well, a meteor struck the Earth and wiped out the dinosaurs. I'm sure that's what you've probably been heard. That's what your children have been taught. It was interesting to hear what these paleontologists and anthropologists said. They said, well, if this were a 7th grade class, we would tell you it's a meteor. But since you're graduate students, we will tell you, we don't have a clue. Okay, and therein lies a very key problem. Things are being presented. People accept them as fact because they come from what they believe is a scientific and solid source of truth. And in fact, it's bogus. But it eliminates a lot of questions in the meantime. Now, there's a simple reason to question Darwinian evolution. None of the mechanisms exist or have been proven. Any other scientific theory would have been rejected already. But there is an aspect to this where it has been embraced to support other political theories and ways of life that make it far more difficult to dislodge. In the West, truth is something that is a fact. If we say, is it true, we're saying, is it a fact? In the East, there is the additional question, does it work? In other words, what happens to someone who holds these viewpoints? Well, with regards to holding to the Bible as a source of truth, the great good that has been done by believers over the last 2,000 years who are convinced that God created us is irrefutable. Yes, there have been those who in the name of Christ did evil and even unspeakable things. But what they did, how they lived their lives and what they believed was in antagonism to Christ's basic teachings. A committed Christian will love his neighbor, turn the other cheek, and bless those who curse him. A Christian scientist will look for God's truth in nature. Isaac Newton said, "I seek for laws because I am convinced there is a lawgiver." In fact, it's amazing how people today who totally deny the existence of God, the existence of a creator, nonetheless seek to reverse engineer his creation in order to find new drugs, in order to find new ways of doing all types of things. So the assumption is they are reverse engineering a totally random organism, a totally random set of facts, a totally random set of anything, to find out some structure that they can copy. It's a little nutty when you think about it. Well, those who believed in Jesus fled England, founded the colonies that led to the ultimate establishment of this incredible United States of America, founded by yet another group of committed believers, dedicated to the proposition that all are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, amongst which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But what happens when people believe that there is no need for a Creator? When the Bible is removed, from where then do such unalienable rights originate? The answer is simple. In a land where there are no absolutes, there cannot be any absolute rights to life, liberty, or anything else. The scriptures say, where there is no vision, the people perish. That's the King James Version. The NIV more accurately translates, where there is no revelation. In other words, no revelation from God. Where there is no supernatural information revealed to people. The people cast off restraint and perish. What happens when Darwinism is embraced? What happens when the Creator's revelation in the Bible is rejected? Well, let's look at the implications of Darwinism. Has it worked in the countries and among the leaders who were most influenced by it? First, let me discuss a little bit about Darwin's theories. His great works, The Origin of Species, actually has a longer title than that. The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or, subhead, the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. You see, Darwin saw the races of men as being different species and used the two terms interchangeably. Now, that is conveniently left off when it's discussed by evolutionists. He was writing at a time in the late 1850s where Louis Pasteur and others had debunked the prior view that was an alternative to creation. It was called spontaneous generation. You put some meat broth out in the sun, and after a few days, little critters grow up in it, maggots and other things. And so that was the proof. See? Life appears spontaneously. Pasteur did the most advanced experiment on it and ultimately proved, without question, and everybody accepted it, that spontaneous generation was bogus, that it was a failed theory, that these were microscopic organisms that ultimately grew. These were not things that came out of the soup. And so, for those who did not believe in God, they needed an alternative theory. There was a vacuum. There was a hunger. They were looking for some alternative to creation. And Darwin proposed the transmutation of species, that species can change, and they change through small adaptations or mutations. In his book, Origin of Species, it's important to note he did not write Origin of Life. He never talks about the origin of life. It is only how do species change. He leaves that question unanswered. He also did not talk about all the implications socially, and that evolution would appear in virtually everything. So we speak about all types of things evolving. Political systems evolve, and so on. Languages, by the way, do not evolve. They devolve. If you go back to ancient Sanskrit, that was a better ordered and better structured language than Greek that descended from Sanskrit, which is more ordered than Latin, which descended from it, which is more ordered and structured than the Romance languages, which are more ordered and structured than English. Think about this. In our lifetime, we have lost parts of speech. People don't say if I were, they say if I was. That's the subjunctive. The subjunctive is going away. They don't say drive slowly, they say drive slow. That's an adverb. Adverbs are going away. Languages get mongrelized. They take on words from other languages. They don't evolve. The whole idea that a couple of cavemen grunted and their grunts got better over time and they were able to communicate more, I mean, that's absolute stupidity. There is nothing that you can see to indicate that happens. And yet we continue to think that things are evolving to a better level. Well, some of you lived long enough. Do you think our society is more organized and structured and more compassionate and better than it was? Well, he wrote another book, The Descent of Man. This really was his bestseller. And here he talks about evolution as applied to human beings. Evolution applied to the human race. Actually, not the human race, the human races. And he concludes the Caucasians are the highest form of human to date. But he also thinks that there are things that can be done to hasten and encourage evolution. He bemoans the fact that we care for our feeble. We care for those who are not perfect, because then their progeny wind up diluting and really in some ways hindering evolution. He talks about the advantages there would be if we could breed humans to get better humans going forward. He decides that that probably won't work in our current environment. In The Descent of Man, Chapter 6, which is titled On the Affinities and Genealogy of Man, on the Birthplace and Antiquity of Man, he dreams of a future for mankind when the black races of man, as well as the mountain gorilla of Africa, will hopefully become extinct, thus enhancing the chances for the evolutionary advancement of the more civilized races of men. He also states that both Africans and Aborigines occupy a subspecies between white Caucasians and baboons. He identifies that Africans, Aborigines, and the Irish are lower species.
Wow. How'd they get away with this?
Okay, now he was English. Okay, he was English. Okay, and that's why I'm telling you, this theory has continued to be held because of the absolute ignorance of the population. Anybody who picks up these books and reads them would say, this guy was a fool. He observes that monkeys can smoke and that they seem to derive pleasure from it. He observes that if you amputate a limb, they heal the same way that a human does. He observes any number of things like that and concludes from that that they're close to humans. He didn't know anything about cells. He didn't know anything about all of the things that we've learned over the past almost 200 years, 170 years. And yet his theory hasn't changed for the population and our kids. Only the intelligentsia, only the elite are let in on the secret. By the way, he did not observe that these weaker races were endangered species. He actually encourages extinction because it hastens natural selection. He says, at some future period, not very distant as measured by centuries, and this is a quote, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace the savage races throughout the world. At the same time, the anthropomorphous apes, those that are most like men, will no doubt be exterminated. The break between man and his nearest allies will then be wider, for it will intervene between man in a more civilized state, as we may hope, even than the Caucasian, and some ape as low as a baboon, instead of as now between the Negro or Australian and the gorilla. Do you know how inflammatory this is? Twitter would shut down that immediately today. And yet people just accept Darwin. Not only does evolution free people from the constraints of conscience and morals, so now I'm talking about why do we hold on to it? It frees people from being hindered by their conscience. It frees people from being hindered by any moral code. It also encourages a form of aggressive barbarism. As we've removed Bible from the schools, and we've substituted non-religion, and certainly the religion of evolution is a key part of that, has our society gotten calmer and better, more loving, more compassionate? Have we advanced in terms of the way people deal with people? People claim religion has killed many. And frankly, there have been many people killed in the name of Christianity and other religions. Now, some religions promote that. Study Islam. It promotes jihad, a war against the infidel, and even killing those who would refuse to convert. But if somebody believes the Bible and accepts it as literal, they will love their neighbor, even as Jesus loved us, dying for us, sacrificing for the neighbor, turning the other cheek, doing all types of things. I see a verse over there, let your gentleness be evident to all, the Lord is near. Gentle. It used to be we had gentle men. You don't hear that term very much anymore. Now, if we start to look at the people who embraced this theory and the cultures that embraced this theory, what happened to them? Well, Friedrich Nietzsche certainly was a committed Darwinist, developed the theory of the Superman. Adolf Hitler in Mein Kampf gives passing reference to Darwin's theories. He was an acolyte of both Nietzsche and Darwin. Listen to this quote from Mein Kampf. Man must realize that a fundamental law of necessity reigns throughout the whole realm of nature. Now he's talking about Darwin's theories, and that his existence is subject to the law of external struggle and strife. Darwin spoke about the fact that various species, various animal forms, various organisms compete against one another. And the fittest survive. There is natural selection. Hitler continues on, where the strong are always the masters of the weak, and where those subject to such laws must obey them or be destroyed. One general law leading to the advancement of all organic beings. Let the strongest live and the weakest die. So the strength which each people possesses decides the day. Now always before God in the world, the stronger has the right to carry through what he wills. History proves, he who has not the strength, to him the right in itself profits not a whit. This is Hitler speaking in Mein Kampf. My struggle. The whole world of nature is a mighty struggle between strength and weakness, an eternal victory of the strong over the weak. There would be nothing but decay in the whole of nature if this were not so. Do you hear the echoes of Darwinism there? Darwin had this to say about Christianity. Quote, from its manifestly false history of the earth and from its attributing to God the feelings of a revengeful tyrant, that's his view, not the Bible's view, it is no more to be trusted than the sacred books of the Hindus or the beliefs of any barbarian, end quote. Then he continues on elsewhere and he says, I cannot see how anyone ought to wish Christianity to be true. For if so, the plain language of the text seems to show that the men who do not believe, and this would include my father, brother, and almost all my best friends, will be everlastingly punished. And this is a damnable doctrine. Adolf Hitler. Oh, wait, not Adolf Hitler. I forgot to tell you. That last quote was from the autobiography of Charles Darwin. Okay? Shocked, huh? He didn't think much of Christianity. Hitler summarizes Darwin's thinking. Listen to this from the book Hitler's Secret Conversations, written in 1941. Quote, Christianity is a rebellion against natural law, a protest against nature. Taken to its logical conclusion, Christianity would mean the systematic cultivation of the human failure. In other words, what he is saying is Christianity, because it's compassionate to the weakest, permits them to survive and includes them in society, therefore severely diluting the chance for evolutionary advancement of the human race. That's what he's talking about. Darwin's theories applied in Nazi Germany. How did that work out? 6 million Jews dead, another 6 million or so non-Jews also dead. The devastation of a continent, the disruption of how many hundreds of millions of lives, the fear, the problems, the impact on the world, nothing positive. Well, what about Marxism? Did Darwinism have anything to do with Marxism and socialism generally? Well, what about Karl Marx? In 1860, Karl Marx, he was the writer of the Communist Manifesto, one of his works, perhaps his most substantial. He was a committed Darwinist. The dedication from the Communist Manifesto says this, quote, Darwin's book is very important and serves me as a basis in natural science for the class struggle, thus revealing the importance of the theory of evolution for communism. He repeated this in a letter to a friend named LaSalle on January 16, 1861. Marx combined his social and economic ideas with evolutionary principles. Marx wrote that Darwin's book, quote, contains the basis in natural science for our views, unquote. Marx spoke about the dialectic and how you have the bourgeoisie, the elite, and you have the proletariat, just the common people, that over time you wind up with a battle. Now, he was dealing in the aftermath of the feudal system, and that was what he was familiar with, and really kind of the beginnings of modern capitalism. In his mind, those who owned the factories were just like the landowners, and those who worked in the factories were just like the peasants, and they needed to be freed from a new type of feudal slavery. And he felt that over time, you wind up with those who are oppressed rising up and overturning, and that history moves forward in that way, in that it evolves. His disciple Lenin applied utter ruthlessness and terror in Russia. In fact, the term rivers of blood has commonly been applied in describing Lenin's reign. He was a committed Darwinist. Darwinism was of such great importance to communism that only months after Darwin's book was published, Frederick Engels, another one of the early philosophers and founders of Marxism, wrote this. He wrote this to Marx. Quote, Darwin, who I am just now reading, is splendid, unquote. Marx wrote back to Engels on December 19th saying, this is the book which contains the basis in natural history for our view. He was excited to have found that in natural history, and to his mind science, provided a basis for their political views. He revealed his sympathy for Darwin by sending a personally inscribed copy of his most important work, Das Kapital, to him. And people could argue whether it was Das Kapital or the Communist Manifesto, which was his most important work. But he sent a copy of Das Kapital to Darwin, and in the inscription, Marx described himself as a, quote, sincere admirer, unquote, of Charles Darwin. In 1918, Leon Trotsky, a man fanatically committed to Darwinism and Marxism both, communist leader, was brutal against the Christian church. He said that Darwin's ideas, quote, intoxicated him. And, quote, Darwin stood for me like a mighty doorkeeper at the entrance to the temple of the universe, unquote. With no creator's laws to restrain him and the justification of evolution, he felt free to use any means whatsoever to attain power and his political ends. Frederick Engels, who I mentioned before, an admirer of Darwin, wrote this, quote, nature is the test of dialectics, and it must be said that in the last resort, nature works dialectically and not metaphysically. In this connection, Darwin must be named before all others, unquote. He's saying the pillar of what we believe in our political theories is Charles Darwin. How has that avoided disclosure? Well, the same way the gradualism, or the absence of the gradualism in the fossil record has. These are disturbing truths. Just as Darwin discovered the law of evolution in organic nature, so Marx discovered the law of evolution in human history. Quote from Frederick Engels. In another of his works, Engels stressed the importance of Darwin's having developed a theory opposed to religion. He, that is Darwin, dealt the metaphysical conception of nature the heaviest blow by his proof that the organic world of today, plants, animals, and consequently man too, now this is Engels speaking, that these things, he says, that this is the product of a process of evolution going on through millions of years. So he continues to compare evolution as he understood it in the animal record to political evolution, with the ultimate end being communism. Engels went so far as to write an article that was titled, quote, the part played by labor in the transition from ape to man, unquote. Do you see the tight linkage? Remember, any theory should be tested on what works. What works? What is the outcome of applying that theory in real life? Well, what happens? Well, the American researcher Conway Zirkle explains why the founders of communism immediately accepted Darwin's theory. He says Marx and Engels accepted evolution almost immediately after Darwin published The Origin of Species. Evolution, of course, was just what the founders of communism needed to explain how mankind could have come into being without the intervention of any supernatural force, and consequently it could be used to bolster the foundations of their materialistic philosophy. Just as evolution came into this vacuum because spontaneous generation was now proven false, they were saying that this political theory that they had could come into existence only if you eliminate a creator. He continues on and he says, in addition, Darwin's interpretation of evolution, that evolution had come about through the operation of natural selection, gave them an alternative hypothesis to the prevailing teleological explanation. I was talking about the ends of things. The teleological explanation of the observed fact that all forms of life are adapted to their conditions. It was Lenin who made Marx's project of communist revolution come true. Lenin, the leader of the communist Bolshevik movement in Russia, aimed to bring down the Tsarist regime in Russia by force of arms. Now, you should note that the Tsar as the king's, Tsar, by the way, is the Russian way of saying Caesar. Okay, the Kaiser is the German way of saying Caesar. The Tsar was there per the belief of the church at that time, as a result of the, quote, divine right of kings, God putting kings in place. Our Declaration of Independence was actually a plea to God to explain and defend why we get to a point where righteous, godly men need to overturn and resist and ultimately get rid of the rule of a king who they believed had been appointed by God. It was far more that than it was an appeal to men. It was an explanation to men, certainly. And so what you were dealing with in Russia was the Tsar who was in place, who was certainly supported by the church, and they needed an alternative theory. And in their case, it was eliminate God, not make a plea as we did with our Declaration of Independence. The chaos after World War I gave the Bolsheviks the opportunity they had been seeking. With Lenin at their head, the communists seized power by the use of arms in October 1917. Now that's the Julian calendar, October. After the revolution, Russia was the scene of a bloody 3-year civil war between communists and the supporters of the Tsar. Like the other communist leaders, Lenin often stressed that Darwin's theory was the fundamental basis of dialectical materialist philosophy. The dialectic was, and this change that would come in political environment really was the equivalent of natural selection in the animal environment. And one of his statements reveals his view of Darwinism. Quote, Darwin put an end to the belief that the animal and vegetable species bear no relation to one another except by chance, and that they were created by God and hence immutable. In other words, by showing that they change, he shows that these were not created by God and established and put in place. Trotsky, counted the most important architect of the Bolshevik Revolution after Lenin, again attached great importance to Darwin. He declared his admiration for Darwin in the following way, quote, Darwin's discovery is the highest triumph of the dialectic in the world, in the whole field of organic matter, end quote. Are you getting a picture here? Do you see a relationship between Marxism/communism and Charles Darwin? Following Lenin's death in 1924, Stalin, Joseph Stalin, the bloodiest dictator in the history of the world, became basically the leader of the Communist Party. Throughout his 30 years in power, Stalin would try to prove just what a ruthless system communism was. 1930, Joseph Stalin, the world's worst mass murderer, he actually studied originally at a college in Tbilisi, Georgia, theological college, because he was studying to be a priest as a teenager. And then he got a copy of Darwin's Origin of Species. It changed his life. Here is a quote from a biography. He said this, God's not unjust. He doesn't actually exist. We've been deceived. If God existed, he'd have made the whole world more just. I'll lend you a book and you'll see, he told a friend. Well, a teenage Stalin, after reading The Origin of Species, did loan this to a friend, and that friend later confirmed that Stalin became an atheist after reading Darwin while studying theology. Well, Stalin was still alive. That friend, G, I don't know what that first letter stands for, and I can't pronounce his last name, Gurdjieff or something similar, recounted how Stalin had become an atheist in the book, the recounting was in the book Landmarks in the Life of Stalin that Gurdjieff wrote. And he relates how Stalin had stopped believing in God and had told him that the reason for this was Darwin's book, even pressuring him into reading it too. So this is not some myth made up by Christians or anti-evolutionists or anti-Marxists or anti-communists. At a very early age, this is a quote, while still a pupil in the ecclesiastical school, Comrade Stalin developed a critical mind and revolutionary sentiments. He began to read Darwin and became an atheist. Imagine how many people would be alive today if that book had just not passed into his hands. Stalin was expelled from the theology college at age 19, understanding that evolution provided no basis for conscience or morals. He was therefore free to torture and to murder with no limits on his conscience. He could murder and torture to whatever extent he chose in order to achieve his communist goals. The end of communism justified, or not the termination of communism, but the ultimate goal of communism justified whatever means without any biblical constraints. Stalin's first important move was to take over the fields of the peasants who made up 80% of the population of Russia. And he took them over in the name of the state, in the name of this policy of collectivization, which was intended to do away with private property. You remember from our discussions previously on socialism and Marxism that a key goal of socialism and Marxism, communism, is the elimination of private property. That socialism is an intermediate goal, according to Marx, on the pathway to communism. Well, in the name of this policy of collectivization, there was a terrible famine. Millions of women, children, and the elderly who could find nothing to eat ended their lives writhing in hunger. The death toll in the Caucasus alone was over 1 million. Stalin killed some 20 million people in his lifetime. Historians have revealed that this savagery gave him enormous personal pleasure. It gave him great pleasure to sit at his desk in the Kremlin and examine the lists of those who had died in the concentration camps or who had been executed. One little book handed to him as an impressionable teenager. He explained the importance he attached to Darwin's ideas, lest someone think that we're making this up. Quote, "There are 3 things that we do to disabuse the minds of our seminary students. We had to teach them the age of the earth, the geologic origin, and Darwin's teachings." End quote. I could go on, but I think you get the picture. Stalin, Mao Zedong, Pol Pot, Castro have all derived their philosophy from Marx. How many tens of millions have they killed? If truth is to be judged based upon what works, what the outcome is of accepting a particular belief, Darwinism fails the test. The evil that it has unleashed upon the world, even if it were true, we would choose to reject if we looked at it in this way. But the fact of the matter is, there is no truth to it. The underpinnings of Darwinism do not appear. The proof does not appear in the fossil record. It doesn't appear in other areas either. But you know what? It hasn't only corrupted people who run countries, people who have a thirst for political power. It has corrupted those who run companies. John D. Rockefeller could rationalize his predatory business practices by claiming, quote, "The growth of a large business is merely the survival of the fittest," unquote. Andrew Carnegie was converted to Darwinism, quote, "Light came," this is Carnegie speaking, quote, "Light came as a flood and all is clear. Not only had I got rid of theology and the supernatural, but I found the truth of evolution," unquote. We could go to more recent times and see 70-some million infants have been killed. Margaret Sanger was a committed evolutionist. Beyond that, she bought into the whole idea of eugenics. The idea that you could cull from the race or the races those who were weaker. You could abort them. You could prevent them from marrying. You could prevent them from procreating. She, of course, was the founder of Planned Parenthood. Listen to this. She said this, and I could go on with hundreds of quotes from Margaret Sanger that would curl your toes. Quote, "The most merciful thing that a large family does to one of its infant members is to kill it," unquote. She wrote that in her book, Women and the New Race, Eugenics Publishing Company, 1920. Quote, another quote, Margaret Sanger, "We do not want word to go out that we want to exterminate the Negro population," unquote. "If it ever occurs to any of their more rebellious members." That's Margaret Sanger. More blacks in this country have been aborted than whites. Where are the Planned Parenthood centers located? Generally in the inner cities. "The marriage bed," she said, another quote from Margaret Sanger, "is the most degenerating influence in the social order," unquote. She was against marriage. Have you sensed an attack on marriage? Do you see how that actually links all the way back to Darwinism? Well, when you look at these things, you have to say, why don't people know these things? Well, we live in a time where there's a base assumption that is presented, and peer pressure within our society at all levels makes it very difficult to propose that Charles Darwin had a theory that was abjectly false, that does not describe what we know and what we see today. I had a professor in seminary who said, "Scratch a skeptic and you'll find a sinner." Well, what we find is that here is a belief system, if you base it on evolution, that enables somebody to be released from any sense of guilt, from any idea that there are constraints on behavior, from any pattern of life that might limit them from what they would enjoy doing or think they would enjoy doing. As we go forward over the next couple of weeks, we'll look at some things that have to do with the proof or lack of proof related to Darwinism, and actually the fact that you now have scientists who are so overwhelmed by the facts that they are denying Darwinism publicly and even risking their careers. And in some cases, they have lost their jobs. Not just Christians, not just believers. The facts are that overwhelming. Anyway, thank you very much for coming today.